Dear Sir, I read Mrs. Buller's letters this morning, which gave me great unease. I think you are in a wrong method in bringing yourself too low instead of taking the advice of a physician. If I was in your place, I would consult with one who's used to train running footmen, for at the same time that they make them as clean as possible, they take proper care to invigorate them. Now, certainly that is the point to be aimed at, for in my opinion, and I've inquired a good deal about this affair, there is more danger in being too low than too high. I beg of you to take care to put yourself in such a condition as you would do if you were obliged to ride a match or run some miles for a good wager. I'm convinced no better rule can be given. Physicians in general are no good judges in affairs of this kind. Those who have had experience in this case are only to be depended upon, and I can assure you that Mr. Ramby and Mr. Hawkins, who've inoculated thousands, are of the opinion which I have advised. I most heartily wish you success if you pursue this design. Raise your strength and spirits up, and I hope you may walk about your room all the while, as the Danish ambassador did during the whole time of his inoculation and never had any eruption. I shall trouble you no further, but to assure you that you will have the constant prayers of your most affectionate, faithful, humble servant, Bathurst, Cirencester, October the 8th, 1755.
The time you came so reasonably to the relief of my wife, you may remember that I mentioned something to you concerning inoculation, and I was apprehensive I might not be so fit a subject to venture on it with safety, as I was of a fuller constitution, a fact to which you then said was no objection to my going through it, but added that you made it a rule never to advise anyone to be inoculated. Since that time, inoculation has been in the country practiced with so great success that it has in a manner determined me to venture on it with my youngest children this instance, as the specky pox has been for 2 years past, and still is very rife in town. I desire, therefore, you could send me such directions as you may think most proper to be observed by me both in the preparation and afterwards. At Exeter and Tiverton and in Cornwall, there have been several persons of different ages inoculated lately, and not one of them in any danger. In the Philosophical Transactions published this year, I found there have been 70 lately inoculated, and not one of them was in any danger, and 'tis said that but 3 out of 640 have been inoculated at the smallpox hospital have failed, and that 'twas very doubtful any one of these died through inoculation. If I find some differences in the manner of which the operation should be performed, as some make an incision with a lancet, over which they bind a docile dipped in infected matter, and others attach that the best method of doing it is by only nicking a small scratch with a needle, and then they take up so much matter on the point of the needle as will lie on it, and mix with the same drop of blood that follows the incision of the needle, as they say that the quantity of matter thrown into large rooms may possibly occasion the worst kind of the disorder. And some recommend keeping on the matter for a day or 2, and others are removing it at 12 to 16 hours after it is put on. And some, I find, recommend cabbage leaves as the most proper dressing, and others use diaclyon plaster, and some think that it is safer to inoculate in the legs as the most deserving. You'll be pleased to be as particular as possible with regard to the manner that I should be practised in. I am sensible it must be a good deal of trouble to you to answer all the above particulars, but if you'll be pleased to do it in any particular, I shall esteem myself much obliged to you, and will not fail of making all due acknowledgments.
To James Buller, Esquire, November the 11th. Honoured Sir, 'tis with the greatest pleasure imaginable that I hear of your safe recovery, but with the same terrors to myself, as well as to many others, to hear that the smallpox is like to be brought among us. I was in great hopes that the care would be taken at King's Nimpton House would prevent any spreading of the disorder, and if others were to be inoculated, I was at first told would be done at some convenient distance, at Great Heel or Hill Head, or at a distance from town. But this report has put many of us into a panic. There are old men and women, as well as those of grown years, that have large families, that have been great drinkers and foul feeders, that think inoculation a sin, and consequently will have it in a natural way, by which means many must die, which might otherwise have lived many, many years longer. And think you not, sir, that those who brought the disorder into the place will be by their surviving friends and relations looked upon in a very disagreeable manner? As for my own part, if you intend to bring it into the town, I cannot help it. I have places enough to go, and friends enough to supply my place. But many grown persons look upon it in the same manner as the plague, as if it were coming amongst them. However acceptable and beneficial it will be to some, be assured that it is fully so disagreeable and will be deadly to others. And I believe if the sentiments of the majority of the town was to prevail, it would certainly pass in the negative. Mrs. Southcombe joins me in compliments to yourself, your lady and family, who am, honoured sir, your most obedient servant, George Southcombe. The Parsonage, 11th of November, 1755. I am very sorry that any brother clergyman should be so unfair as to divulge a letter which I only showed to justify my own conduct. To copy the draft letter I am not able, Mrs. Southcombe having it in her own custody, and will not spare it. She gives her compliments, and says she thinks it very wrong to divulge a letter or an affair which might breed a disturbance. I am satisfied that Dr. Barber is a man of too much honour and honesty to write a thing which he would not assert. Dr. Barber, I am satisfied, knows mine as well as Mrs. Southcombe's constitution so well that he would prescribe arsenic we have taken it. He has cured us when others could not. As for inoculation, from many motives, Mrs. Southcombe, as well as myself, are determined not to undergo. And considering the position of the family, that no one will or can take us in. Considering as the only servant maid that has had the smallpox is gone from us, and yet therefore we have no one yet we can trust with our keys, nor to look after our pheasants, cattle, etc. We must be determined to stay, and indeed the superscription under your own hand has so frightened me that I have been very sick ever since. And after death, which I think must ensue, I hope through the merits of my Saviour to have a more comfortable life. As for our passions being beyond reason, I hope I may venture to affirm your behaviour to me is reckoned the most unreasonable, and so any gentleman or clergyman would say, might they speak freely. I am honoured, sir, your most humble servant, George Southcombe. For the Honourable Lady Jane Buller, King's Nimpton. Honoured Madam, Mr. Hutton having informed me that Mr. Buller's health would not permit him to read the letter I sent him, I take the liberty, which I hope will be pardoned, to send you this. The talk of inoculation in the town has put at least 9 out of 10 parts of the town into such a hurry that it is impossible to describe their deplorable conditions. There is nothing but tears that are to be seen. The men have had them lament their wives, who think it sinful to be inoculated. The wives are in tears for their husbands' fates, and sit dropping of tears on the faces of their suckling children. Some of the poorest sort of men are preparing to flee from their families, by which they would be immediately parish charges. There is none but myself that can dare to plead on their behalf. I think it is my duty to lay open to the distresses of my parishioners, and humbly hope and implore, both for myself and them, that you will endeavour to persuade those who are willing to inoculate their families, not to inoculate them in the town. And you have the most hearty thanks of hundreds, as also of Honourable Madam, your most obedient and most humble servant, George Southcombe.
Mr. Buller's compliments to Mr. and Mrs. Southcombe. He is extremely sorry to find that they are in such a disordered state of mind, which he is persuaded is entirely owing to that extraordinary letter which Dr. Barber has lately sent them, of which Mr. Buller must again repeat his desire of having a copy, and begs that if they don't think it fit otherwise to grant it, that they should apply to the doctor for his leave to communicate it to him. Mr. Buller begs that Mr. and Mrs. Southcombe would endeavour to compose their minds so that reason might hold its due restraint over their passions, and in order thereto he wishes that they would take a ride tomorrow somewhere near the city of Exeter, where they might consult with such physicians as have been most conversant in the practice of inoculation in this county. Dr. Barber has had no experience in the practical way of inoculation by his recommending mercurials. Mr. Buller is persuaded he is very little acquainted with the theory of it, for mercury, by its great momentum, is apt to increase the velocity of the blood, which is a thing that is chiefly to be avoided in the preparation for inoculation. And therefore the most eminent physicians prescribe only the most cooling purges. For though Mr. Buller has had a very numerous eruption, yet he has in all circumstances had the disorder in the most favourable way, for which under God he thinks himself greatly indebted to the care, skill, and integrity of Mr. Tossell. Mr. Buller had a little but very far from violent pain in his head, but he has during the whole course of his disorder hardly perceived the least pain in his back, sickness of his stomach, or any internal heat whatsoever. The eruptions appeared on Tuesday last night, and began to turn the Saturday following, and so continued turning gradually in the most kindly manner. Mr. Buller sat up yesterday for the first time, has been up near 5 hours this day, and continues to gain strength as fast as he can possibly wish. Written in Kingsnipton, November the 17th, 1755.
I was always ready to lay down my life for the service of yourself, your lady and family. I have esteemed it an honour and happiness to be in your favour, and a misery to be out of it. I loved you and feared you as if you'd been a parent, and don't know that ever I did anything willingly to disoblige you. But now I am cruelly treated. I hope your goodness and the goodness of your lady will even yet put a stop to this, which might end in the destruction of bodies, if not souls. Yourself told me the last time, or the last but one, that I saw you, that you would not advise me to be inoculated. You were forced to do it because of going to town. Your lady assured me that she would do what she could to prevent the infection from coming to Kingsnipton. As for Dr. Barber's letter, I have not got it, neither do I know where it is. I shall with Lord Lovat conclude, as you are stout, so be you merciful. Yours in great affliction, George Southcombe.
Mr. Buller is sorry to find that Mr. Southcombe was capable of behaving in the manner that he has done on this occasion. His menace to Luxton was cruel and unjustifiable. Mr. Buller wishes he would say no more on this occasion till he has consulted with some sensible person, and he would particularly recommend him to Mr. Southcombe of Honiton, Mr. Hutton, Mr. John Hole, or Mr. Webb of Chumley. Then he is persuaded Mr. Southcombe will be thoroughly convinced that he has said abundantly enough already. If Mr. Buller may be excused for giving his opinion freely, he thinks for the part which Mr. Southcombe has acted on this occasion is as little agreeable to the dictates of reason as it is to those of goodness and the regard to his parishioners. A retirement to Hanover or Honiton for a few weeks cannot be supposed to be very disagreeable or inconvenient, especially as Mr. Southcombe has very lately intimated his intention of settling at Hanover and coming here only twice a year to receive his tithes. As to what he is pleased to say that people are so averse to, it seems to show that he is greatly misinformed, as they are continually making applications to Kingsdompton House to have both themselves and families included in the number of the inoculated. It is not proposed that the operation be performed on any of the village within this 10 days.
For James Buller, Esquire. Mr. Southcombe is equally as sorry to think that there are persons capable of the thought of driving away people from their habitations this vigorous season of the year, where they have laid upon provisions for themselves and cattle. Mr. Southcombe's message to Luxton was no more cruel than what would have been done by another person half a year ago, if a tenant of his had thought fit to be inoculated in his own court. The great law of nature, self-preservation, justifies it. When a man's life and all that is near to him is concerned, 'tis something hard if he must not make remonstrances. As for Mr. Southcombe's conduct to be contrary to reason, it seems to him much more unreasonable that people must be forced to be inoculated to avoid the disorder in a natural way, as whatever may be said, is fact, excepting a few families, as being contrary to the regard for my parishioners. I know none of my parishioners fond of it, and the farmers are entirely averse to it, and think it very hard that their proper minister should be driven from them for the sake of our parishioners. It having been reported that Mr. Southcombe was the first that ever talked about inoculation and being inoculated in the town, this is to certify that there are many that are now and have been in Mr. Southcombe's house lately that heard him declare that he would not be inoculated in Kingsdompton town for £1,000 for fear of spreading the disorder, and that he thought it a very wicked thing to bring in an infectious distemper. Sam Holland told Mr. Southcombe just now before witnesses that he never made applications to anyone, nor desired ever to have his children inoculated. Het Gomer, in presence of Mr. Daddo's boy, that she would not have had their children inoculated for anything if the houses about her were not to be inoculated. So would be the general answer, if they might dare to speak their minds freely to those that ask them, excepting about 4 families, perhaps not so many.
Reverend Sir, enclosed I have sent you a parcel of papers and letters which Mr. Southcombe has sent here, by which you will see he is in the most miserable, distracted state of mind, to retrieve him, from which all the endeavours of Mr. Hutt and Mr. Webb have proved ineffectual, and we therefore can think of no other person, as he will pay no sort of regard to any of his relations, that can have any weight with him but yourself. And therefore I desire that out of compassion and charity to Mr. Southcombe, you would not fail of being at the parsonage tomorrow, in order, if possible, to assist Mr. Southcombe in the recovery of his senses. Last Saturday se'nnight, Mr. Southcombe sent his boy here with a message, intimating that if I did succeed well under inoculation, that Mr. Southcombe did indeed to be inoculated, but no consideration was taken of the poor inhabitants of the village. The beginning of the week after, we had so many earnest applications from the poor desiring to be inoculated, that I esteemed it to be almost unanimous request of the whole parish to have the operation performed on them, which I by no means could, and I thought indeed I by no means ought to discourage. The unanimity of their request will sufficiently appear to you by a paper which I will order to be laid before you tomorrow. I therefore gave orders for their being supplied with all proper kinds of necessaries, and directed Mr. Tossell to inoculate them at my expense, and this I ordered to be imparted to Mr. Southcombe, who thereupon sent word that they would send for the doctor immediately and be inoculated. But the doctor, instead of coming, wrote one of the most extraordinary letters that was ever penned, which has hurried them out of their senses. He intimated that no physician of character ever advised inoculation, and that it was only practised by quacks and mountebanks. Upon the receipt of this letter of Dr. Barber's, Mr. and Mrs. Southcombe grew immediately frantic and outrageous. They first sent to Luxton to know whether he and his family intended to be inoculated, and upon being answered in the affirmative, they sent word again that he should immediately remove out of the house which he had taken of Mr. Southcombe for a certain term. Luxton returned him for answer that he was determined to be inoculated and stay in the said house, on which 'twas reported that the walls of the house should be pulled down. On hearing of these violent procedures, and not being able to bear the thoughts of a poor man being so oppressed, I sent to Mr. Southcombe to let him know that his menace to Luxton was cruel and unjustifiable, and to beg that he would reflect on the consequence of such measures. The parson's man had 2 children whom he begged to have inoculated, and desired the parson's consent, but was answered that he should be turned immediately out of the work the first moment he attempted any such thing. However, the man and his wife, being convinced of the usefulness of inoculation, has brought his children to Mr. Tossell to be inoculated, and was immediately discharged from Mr. Southcombe's employment, and has since taken into mine. I never yet knew an instance where such a new thing was at once so readily approved of, so unanimously desired as this operation has been by the common people. I am now sitting up for the 3rd day, and thank God gain strength as fast as possibly I can wish. I must again repeat my earnest desire that you would not on any account fail of being at the parsonage tomorrow. Our best services attend you and your family. I am, Reverend Sir, your most faithful, humble servant, James Buller, sent to the Reverend Mr. Dardo at Tiverton. Reverend Sir, it is a great satisfaction to me to find that every reasonable argument which might tend towards Mr. Southcombe's preservation has been in so full and candid a manner laid before them by you. There is no forcing the stream in this case, and if Mr. Southcombe will now obstinately run into danger, he will be now solely accountable for it. I will order the original list signed by all the persons who are to be inoculated, together with a copy of it, to be sent up to you tomorrow morning, early, which you may take the proper use of. There is but poor hopes of succeeding in an argument with those who will not confine themselves within the bounds of truth. I know not a single instance of anyone being offered money to undergo the operation, nor of anyone being improperly pressed to submit to it. 2 poor families in the town who depend entirely for support on their masters for the men's wages, I have promised to assist with their usual wages till such time as they shall be able to come to their work again. They are Shapcut's and Louday's families. I know not of a single farthing promised or offered to any other persons, but I have given express directions that none of them shall want any proper assistance, which I trust I shall on all occasions be ready to give them, as I cannot but in some sort look on them as the distant members of my family. To go further, I must say that Mr. Southcombe, by retiring, would, I believe, in a great measure contribute to the advancement of religion in his parish, for by his folly pride he has made himself quite contemptible in the eyes of the parishioners. And if he would absent himself for a little while, and you would be so good as to take the care of the parish on you for 3 Sundays only in the approaching holidays, I am persuaded the good effects of it would appear by a double number of communicants at the sacrament. He will at least, I hope, now excuse my receiving any further messages from him till he shall appear to have in some measure recovered the use of his reason. I am, Reverend Sir, your most faithful, humble servant, Kingsnipton, November 19th, 1755. Kingsnipton, November the 20th, 1755. Reverend Sir, I shall leave to your discretion to acquaint Mr. Sefton what I have observed to you, either in the same words that I have used or in any softer language that you shall think proper. 'Tis far from my desire to inflame, but rather so quiet and cool, for which I propose I should be ready to lend to Mr. Southcombe all those helps and assistances which charity can suggest. But still under his present circumstances, I shall avoid him with as much care and anxiety as I should a creature infected with a canine madness. What may not be dreaded from the passions of a silly man egged on by the more furious ones of an enraged wife and a favourite maid? He has shown already by his letters and messages to me that he did not scruple to scatter the terrors of hell and damnation in the face of everyone who will not comply with his desires. Surely one cannot too carefully guard against the effects that such rants may have on ignorant and weak minds at this particular season, and therefore if Mr. Southcombe does not immediately withdraw, and promise on the true faith of a Christian not to raise any more such disturbances, I shall then, as the best expedient I can think of to preserve the minds of my fellow parishioners from being disturbed, apply to the bishop for a short suspension, which I think his own letters and papers will sufficiently warrant. And in such case, I could then wish that you might be appointed to take care of the parish in his stead. No man can have that effect on them, as you will, as no one is better respected by them. From what Mr. Southcombe has wrote me, cannot be doubted but that he has tried every method he can think of to terrify people from submitting to this operation, and it can be no wonder if it may have diverted some weak minds from such intentions. Frank Lane, whom he mentions as having no inclination for the operation, married Mr. Southcombe's maid, over whom, though I know not how, he still maintains a great influence. Let that influence be withdrawn, and I doubt not but he will follow the example of his elder brother. He decided to have his wife and 4 children inoculated. As to others, it may be averse to the operation, though I am convinced upon a fair examination there will be found but few such. For their better and more secure accommodation, I have offered them the free use of some of my farmhouses in the neighbourhood, which will conveniently hold a great many. The inclination of the majority of the inhabitants will, by the paper which shall be laid before you this day, appear beyond all contradiction to be greatly in favour of the operation. Nay, I am convinced that there is not one sensible person in the whole parish that disapproves of it, not any one that can produce an argument against it which may bear the least appearance of reason. I am your most faithful, humble servant, James Buller.
Dear Sir, I believe I would not surprise you that I am infinitely pleased at your good success in the inoculation. I have long had a great opinion of the practices, but as I have known but 4 adult persons undergo the operation, I could not venture to advise you to it, and was under great anxiety till I heard you were well. I think you are doing a very right and humane thing in putting yourself to the expense of inoculating the poor people of the parish, and the parson and his wife must be very wrong-headed to oppose it. One consequence will arise from their opposing you. They may keep off some of the parishioners from undergoing the operation at present, but as soon as they are informed of the good success of their neighbours, they will flock in and partake of your charity, in spite of all his arguments against it. I don't know that I have since talked with the Bishop of Exeter upon the subject, but I will take the first opportunity to do it, and I believe Mr. Southcombe will not stand higher in his esteem for his conduct for this occasion. I can only say that I shall not be disposed to put my body under the care of Dr. Barber, nor my soul under Dr. Southcombe. Perhaps they are not at present to be matched in all England. I wish them no other harm than that they were both sent to Russia to practice and preach there. I am your most affectionate and faithful humble servant, Bathurst, 25th of November, 1755.